Hello, everybody, both in person and online. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. My name is Lizzie Meister. I'm the Public Programs Manager here, and I'm thrilled to get to welcome you all to this museum and on Zoom on this rainy day here in New Orleans, and hopefully the weather might be a little bit better if you're a distance folk. And I'm really excited to get to present welcome our two presenters, Dr. Reuben Sloan and Gail Cohn, to talk about their presentation Corresponding Angles. Before I get started, I always have to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping and housekeeping in general. If you're on Zoom, we ask that you stay muted, and if you have questions, which I'm sure you will, please pop those into the chat and I will read them aloud here at the end of the presentation. Might have given our folks in person a hint that at the end there'll be time for Q&A. And we really encourage you to ask the questions that you're interested in learning about. I want to also acknowledge some of the folks that make the museum run today. We have some board members here. Janice Reuben, Leslie Lux, and Morris Mintz are here, as well as I'm sure there's some board members on Zoom, but I can't see your faces. So thank you all for helping us make this museum possible, and everybody here for helping make this presentation possible. And now I would like to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Reuben Sloan hails from Southern California in Los Angeles, where he attended UCLA for his undergraduate studies in kinesiology and UC Irvine for medical school. He moved to New York City in the early 90s for residency training in physical medicine and rehabilitation at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. After completing his residency, he moved to the South in 1996, when Atlanta hosted the Olympics, to do a fellowship in sports medicine at the renowned Houston Clinic in Columbus, Georgia, where, after completing his fellowship, he remained on staff as an attending physician until 1999. In late 1999, he moved to Atlanta to join Resurgence Orthopedic, one of the largest private orthopedics group in the country, where he continues to practice today and is now a senior partner. He is a highly regarded physician and received many accolades, including multiple top doctor and excellence in teaching awards. He, his wife Debbie, and daughter Lauren enjoy traveling, are passionate about World War II and Holocaust history, and they've visited numerous museums and concentration camps in Central and Eastern Europe. Reuben and his family are rabid Georgia Bulldogs fans. Thank you, Reuben, Dr. Reuben Sloan, for being here. And Gail Cohn has been a facilitator, speaker, and workplace coach who has been doing business at Leadership Consultants for more than 40 years. She has also completed mediation training, extensive human resource management development, including classes sponsored by the American Management Association, creative training techniques, University of Mississippi, the Einstein Consulting Group, and Georgia State's Consortium on the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. In addition, Gail has facilitation certification from Learning International, Singer Miller, Performax, and the Anti-Defamation League's A World of Difference. She is also a former creator and host of a radio show called Book Talk with Gail on Radio Sandy Springs, and an original member by appointment of Governor Zell Miller of the Georgia Human Relations Committee, where she served for 8 years, as well as being a past president of several nonprofit entities. She is an honored graduate of her beloved University of Georgia, has a Bachelor of Science in Education and Master's of Science in Human Resource Management. Gail is currently involved with interfaith work, is a certified mediator, facilitates workshops and panel discussions, is a speaker for the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust, is a Sandy Springs Civic Roundtable Program Chair, an active member of the Sandy Springs Society, Leadership Sandy Springs Leadership Group of Temple Sinai, and on the board of Weinstein Hospice and Collections Committee and Strategic Planning Committee for the William Bremen Jewish Museum. Gail enjoys spending time with her husband, Harvey Danitz, children, and 6 grandchildren, tap dancing and going to UGA football games, playing mahjong with her friends. Would like to welcome you both to the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience, and thank you so much for being here today.
So sometimes when I hear an introduction, I think, it's okay, just go ahead and do my eulogy. Sounds pretty good sometimes. But before we begin our presentation, We have a couple of people we'd like to acknowledge. First of all, we want to acknowledge the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience for the important work that you have done. And we also want to thank Lizzie Meister for her attention to detail and for helping us to arrange this program. So thank you very much, Lizzie. It really is wonderful that you all came out this evening, and we want to thank you for being here in the audience, as well as those people on Zoom, to remember the Holocaust by listening to these two stories. It's an extra honor for me to be here this evening, to be in this special place, in this museum that is dedicated to preserving Jewish culture in the Deep South. I am a Southern Jew. I am a child of the South. My mother was born in Selma, Alabama, as were many generations before her. My father, although a first-generation American, was born in Columbus, Georgia, and Columbus, Georgia is also my hometown. So thank you for preserving this important heritage, and thanks to all the staff and all of you for making this happen and this museum come to fruition. We are very grateful. It is always my pleasure to be on the program with Dr. Reuben Sloan, who is a fabulous doctor, and he's my doctor, and a very trusted and dear friend. So Reuben is going to begin our story, and then I'll return to conclude it. Reuben.
Thank you. This is the story of a young Jewish boy named Itsc. He was born nearly 100 years ago in 1925. He has 4 siblings, all brothers. He is the second oldest. His parents are Ezra and Leah Slodowski. They live in a small town, Ozorkov, in Western Poland, which is considered part of the Greater Lodz region. Ezra, his father, is a Schmied, or what we would call a blacksmith in English. He is big and strong, a necessary prerequisite for the job. At over 200 pounds and over 6 feet tall, he is considered a giant amongst his peers. All of Ezra's male relatives, including his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, uncles, and cousins were or are blacksmiths. His mother, Leah, is a homemaker and is quite the looker. By all accounts, she is one of the most beautiful women in town. Her family are Webers, or what we would call weavers in English, and have been for generations. As the Greater Lodz region of Poland is considered a manufacturing capital, this is by no surprise that her family are weavers. As Itsc grows, he excels in athletics and becomes a very talented soccer player. Circled in red is the Greater Lodz region of Western Poland. The small arrow seen within the circle is pointing to where Ozorkov is located with respect to Lodz, the second largest city in Poland, second only to the capital, Warsaw. Ozorkov is roughly 30 kilometers northwest of Lodz, roughly the same distance as where we are right now at this museum to the international airport. Life in Ozorkov in the 1920s and 30s is typical of small towns in the area. The population is evenly split between Catholics, Lutherans of German descent, and Jews, both secular and Orthodox. With very rare exceptions, these 3 groups live harmoniously, as each group tends to live and remain in their homogeneous section. The Protestants, for AI of all things. The Protestants with their Lutheran churches on one side of town, the Jews with their synagogues on another, and Polish Catholics with their cathedrals in the center. Much to his parents' chagrin, Itsc is either too young or too rebellious to follow this unwritten rule, as most of his friends and playmates are not Jewish. One of the few places where these different groups interact is the marketplace. This homogeneity also extends to the schools. Itsc attends a secular Jewish boys' day school similar to the one pictured here. Fast forwarding a few years to the mid to late 1930s, Itsc is approaching 13 or bar mitzvah age. Being a secular Jew, he is much more interested in playing soccer than participating in his Jewish studies or learning his Torah portion. His athleticism earns him a place on an elite soccer team. He is the only Jew on the team. As he is quite good, and his team is quite good, they compete all over Poland to represent Lodz. To the west, the Nazis have risen to power. Austria has been annexed, and the racist and anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws have been enacted. Hitler is on a mission to erase the Jews from Europe. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Western Poland, including the Lodz region. The Polish army is ill-equipped and is no match for the might and heavily armored German army. This is the Polish response. Clearly no match. Most believe that Poland fell in just a couple of days because of this horse and buggy defense. This is not necessarily the whole truth. While it was the case in Western Poland, in the eastern part of Poland, there was no invasion, at least not initially. Getting back to Itsc's story, he and his soccer team are in the far northeastern part of Poland, competing near Vilno, while the German invasion is occurring in the west. Word of the invasion eventually reaches his team. Itsc and his team return to Ozorkov. 16 days later, the Russian army invades eastern Poland. With the addition of the Russian invasion, the capital Warsaw falls. Poland is partitioned. Nazi Germany controls western and central Poland. The Russians control the east. With western and central Poland under Nazi occupation, the racist and anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws are enforced. Jews are considered enemies of the Third Reich. They are forced to leave their homes and move into ghettos. Those who hesitate or resist are immediately executed. Itsc, who just turned 14 a few weeks earlier, 14, is hiding out with one of his teammates. Why? When he returned from his soccer tournament, his home was abandoned. His family and his parents and four brothers were nowhere to be found. The song playing in the background is an instrumental version of the song named Offen Pipperchek. It's a Yiddish song written in the late 19th century. The title literally translated means on the fireplace. Typical of many Yiddish songs of the era, the melody is somber and tugs at the heartstrings. Even without knowing the lyrics or what the song is about, the pain and sorrow are unmistakable. The lyrics tell a story of a rabbi teaching young children the alphabet, or the Yiddish or Hebrew alphabet, and the depth and meaning each letter possesses. In the fourth stanza, the lyrics read, "Children, when you grow older, you will understand how many tears lie in these letters, how much lament. The history of our people is written in tears." Notices in both German and Polish are posted everywhere, heralding, aiding or facilitating a Jew is punishable by death. Out of fear for his own life, Itsc's tournmate turns him in. With Itsc no longer in hiding, he is sent to the makeshift ghetto in Ozerkov. His family is still nowhere to be found. A couple of years pass. Itsc is moved from the Ozerkov ghetto to the larger Lodz ghetto, the second largest ghetto in Poland, second only to the Warsaw ghetto. This is an alphabetical transport list of occupants leaving the ghetto in Ozerkov to be transferred to the Lodz ghetto. This list shows Itsc's name circled in red. The far right column, Cohn, highlighted in yellow, translated means remarks. Noted is his arrival date to the Lodz ghetto, 21-7-42, or July 21st, 1942. Life in the Lodz ghetto is difficult due to overcrowding, disease, pestilence, malnutrition, random lineups, and bitter cold. Survival is first and foremost. Having manual skills equates to usefulness or being deemed an essential worker. Being smart and incredibly resourceful, Itsc is constantly reinventing himself, changing his skill set, and therefore his usefulness in order to survive. On this document to the far right, his job or skill is initially written as Neherin, literally translated means clothing maker or seamstress, but it's crossed out and Schmied or blacksmith is written instead. On this list, he's a Schneider or a fabric cutter, or what we would call a tailor. On this list, he's back to being a Schmied or a blacksmith. So, how is that we have photographic accounts of the Lodz ghetto similar to the ones I just showed you and the ones I'm about to show you? Heinrich Ross, a talented Polish Jewish photojournalist, was instructed by the Nazis to take carefully staged or fictitious photographs to better glamorize ghetto life to be later used for Nazi propaganda. Risking certain death, Heinrich Ross secretly photographed the grim realities of what life in the Lodz ghetto was really like. He buried thousands upon thousands of negatives. In 1945, after the Germans surrendered, he returned to Lodz and found about half of these negatives to still be intact. Heinrich Ross is pictured here in the trench unearthing the buried chest. These grim photojournalistic accounts of life in the Lodz ghetto would later become part of an art exhibit and would be displayed in galleries and museums all around the world. Select photo from Heinrich Ross's collection, illustrating the scarcity of food in the Lodz ghetto. Back to Itsc. His resourcefulness at reinventing himself as a worker also extended to finding and getting food. In addition to shoeing the horses, his job as a Schmied was also to care and feed the horses. Using horse food, a crate, a stick, and a string, he built primitive pet traps to catch birds and rodents to eat. He would climb up trees and raid nests for eggs or hatchlings and cook them in a soup. A secretly shot typical Nazi raid and lineup in the ghetto. These lineups would often lead to on-the-spot executions, or if you were lucky, selections. Those that were deemed healthy, helpful, or essential remained. Those that were deemed non-essential or selected were transported to concentration camps. This slide shows the multitude of concentration camps in Germany, annexed Austria, and German-occupied Central and Eastern Poland. More than 1,000. The larger green dots are major labor camps. The red circles with X's are extermination or death camps. The smaller black dots adjacent to either the green or red circles are subcamps. Most of the non-essential individuals selected from the Lodz ghetto were initially sent to Chelmno, shown here. and only later to Auschwitz, the most notorious extermination camp of all. Chelmno has the unfortunate distinction of being Nazi Germany's first extermination camp. Victims were instructed to place their belongings in storage bins. Note the picture to the top right. They were tricked into believing they were being transferred to a work detail or a work camp, but they had to disinfect or shower first. Victims were led up a series of ramps, disrobed, and were eventually tricked into the small room, which turned out to be the freight area of the lorry or van pictured here. They were gassed with carbon monoxide from exhaust funneled into the cargo area as the van drove off. These killing vans, as they've come to be known, there were 4 of them, were driven by prisoners, usually Jews, to a nearby forest where they were buried. These forests are now known as the Killing Forest. Every few weeks, the drivers were executed to ensure secrecy. How do we know these very specific details? Against all odds, 4 people survived Chelmno out of more than 300,000. Of the 4, 3 survived the Holocaust and gave written and/or video testimonies of these atrocities. As the Lodz ghetto was incredibly productive, it remained operational until the spring of 1944. Fortunately for Itsc, when the Lodz ghetto was in the process of being eradicated, being a strong and surprisingly fit young man, he was sent to Dachau, a labor camp just outside of Munich, instead of a death camp like Auschwitz. The gates of Dachau, bearing the infamous phrase, Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. When it was certain the Americans and the other allies would eventually capture Munich, prisoners from Dachau were moved deeper into German-occupied territories. Itsc was sent east to Mauthausen, a horrific labor camp in Austria near Vienna. Mauthausen has this horrendous distinction as it is adjacent to a massive rock quarry and because of the notorious stairs of death. Prisoners are forced to carry large, heavy rock blocks harvested from the quarry on their shoulders up the stairs of death. Note the picture second from the left and the size of the blocks, estimated to be well over 100 pounds. Mauthausen had numerous subcamps, including Ebensee. An image of prisoners from this subcamp is seen on this slide to the far right. It is very likely that Itsc was sent back and forth between the main camp and any one of these subcamps on any given day, including Ebensee. If you haven't figured it out by now, because our last names do not match, Itsc is my father. Of course he survived, but nobody else in his family did. A total of 7. 6 distant cousins, 3 men from his father's side, 3 women from his mother's side, and my father survived. From a greater extended family of well over 120, that's a 6% survival rate. After the war, Itsc was sent to a DP camp or displaced persons camp in Munich. Pictured here are survivors in that DP camp before or after playing a soccer match. Itsc remained at the DP camp for roughly 4 years before immigrating to the US in 1949 and eventually settling in Los Angeles. Why Los Angeles? Why not New York or Philadelphia or New Orleans or Palestine, now Israel, as most other survivors did? There's actually an interesting story. He was supposed to come to New Orleans, but that didn't happen. So I won't elaborate on it now. Ask about it in the question and answers, please. Remember me saying that with rare exceptions, in Ozerkampf, the 3 different groups rarely mixed except for the marketplace. Well, in the early 1930s, there was an incident. This young Jewish man in his late 20s, big guy, 6'2", 6'3", 240 pounds, was minding his own business, and he notices a little Jewish boy getting picked on by teenage Polish kids. And he intervenes, stops the bullying, because first it was verbal and then it became physical. Well, this person grabbed one of the Polish bullies by the neck and was so big and strong, he inadvertently snapped his neck and killed him. That person turned out to be my father's uncle. His name was Meyer Paris. Meyer Paris quickly ran home. The families got together, scraped together their pennies, and got him out of Poland because they knew that he would be made an example of. And he ended up coming to the United States. Because of his size and his strength, he became a very famous wrestler. And his arena was the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, and his stage name was Ivan the Terrible. In Los Angeles, Itsc lived near his uncle Meyer in Boyle Heights, as it was transitioning from a predominantly Jewish neighborhood to a Mexican one. Boyle Heights today is much better known as East Los Angeles. There, in an attempt to learn English, he attended night school at Roosevelt High School, where he met and eventually married my mother, Amparo Vizcaíno, an immigrant from Colima, Mexico in the early 1950s, who was also attending the same school to learn English. In 1954, he was naturalized and changed his name to Irving Sloan. His naturalization documentation dated 7/22/54. In the late 1950s, he bought a rundown fast food restaurant in the Watts section of Los Angeles called the Stop Drive-In. Describing it in New Orleans terms, if that dog and the Waffle House had a love child, it would be the Stop Drive-In. After only a few short years, the Stop, as it was affectionately called by all the locals, became a Watts institution. And eventually a local late night hangout in the 1970s and early 1980s for many African-American celebrity athletes from the Los Angeles sports teams, and for TV actors like Fred Berry, better known as Rerun, from the hit show What's Happening. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, for hip-hop artists from South Central and Compton, including members of NWA, and now famous because of the movie Straight Outta Compton, including Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, and Eazy-E, as Compton is just 3 short miles down the road from where my father's restaurant was. Other claims to fame. He claims he invented chili cheese fries. Wikipedia cites them as being created in 1975. They were on his menu in the early 1970s, so he probably did. The Colossal Burger, most people don't know what that is. Wikipedia claims that it was invented in the 1990s. It was on his menu in the 1980s. A Colossal Burger is 2 quarter-pound patties with 8 ounces of pastrami. And his secret barbecue sauce. Yes, a Polish Jewish kid knew how to make barbecue sauce, and it actually was quite well regarded and famous. It is now bottled and distributed under his partner's name, Gail Sweet and Sassy. The Stop, as I mentioned earlier, as it was called by the locals, and the 2 Jewish boys that ran it, they were both affectionately called Papa Stop by all the locals, were so highly regarded. It was one of the only, if not the only, white-owned establishment to survive both the Watts riots in the 1960s and the Rodney King riots in the 1990s, because his loyal customers formed a human chain around his restaurant to protect it. He is pictured here with some of our family. My oldest sister, Itsc's firstborn, Leah, the fun sister, named after our grandmother or Itsc's mother, Leah. She worked mainly in the food and beverage service industry as a waitress or bartender until she retired several years ago. His 3 other children and 3 out of 7 of his grandchildren. My sister Rosemary, the responsible sister, Itsc's second born and clearly, definitively his favorite. She's watching, so that's why I said that, because it's true. I can see her laughing right now. She was a first grade teacher for many decades until she recently retired just a couple of years ago. Her twins, Matthew and Aubrey, now 34. My older brother, Ezra, named after our grandfather, goes by his middle name, Stephen. Stephen, like my dad, could fix, build, or repair anything. He owned an independent Mercedes garage until 2021. He now works for Matt LeBlanc, who is Joey from Friends, who is a car fanatic and owns many exotic car lots and repair shops. My brother is a shop foreman. Then there's me, Itsc's youngest, named for one of his brothers, Reuben, the misfit in the family, clearly the one that does not fit. All of my siblings had challenges or struggled to some degree in school. My sister Rosemary, the least of the 3. In fact, my sister Leah, I don't think ever graduated from high school. The fun sister, too busy having fun. There are 4 reasons why I don't fit. I, on the other hand, excelled in school. Became a physician, Ivy League trained, Houston Clinic trained, have advanced degrees in multiple board certifications. Number 2, sports, you name it, I played it. Football, basketball, baseball, rugby, I boxed, I even wrestled like Uncle Meyer. My siblings, not so much. I'm the only one that left Los Angeles. All of my siblings still live in LA. And look at how much taller I am in this picture than my siblings. A good 6 to 8 inches taller. And you'll see in a couple of slides, 6 to 8 inches taller than my parents. Clearly the one that does not fit. My precious daughter, Lauren, 8 years old in this photograph, now 29, lives in New York City. My beautiful and multi-talented wife, Debbie, and both of my parents at our wedding in the March of 2003. This was the last picture I could find of him before he passed away 5 years later due to complications for kidney failure. His gravestone in Los Angeles and his date of birth and date of death, notice the asterisks for the date of birth, and on the Jewish calendar, his date of death. Major significance, won't elaborate, i.e., please ask in the question and answers about it. So back to this slide. Why? 2 very good reasons. First, as we know, the Holocaust took millions upon millions of lives. But sadly, it also took one of the most sacred and prized possessions of families, photographs. As I was putting this together, I realized I had no pictures of my father as a child or even as a young adult. They're non-existent. So with that, I have a disclosure. The picture of the very young boy that I used to describe my father is not him. It's actually one of his cousins on his father's side. I stumbled upon it going through the photo archives of Yad Vashem, March of last year. It was placed there by one of the 3 male cousins that survived on his father's side. This was his cousin, so my father's second cousin. His name was Herschel. Herschel died in the Holocaust at the age of 11. I thought I'd play homage to him here. If I could be so lucky in my digging through the archives and stumble across a picture of my dad as a school-age boy, there is no doubt in my mind he would be like this guy. Look at that face. Look at what he's exuding. An undeniable defiance and don't F with me attitude. That is exactly how my father survived the Holocaust and how he had a restaurant for over 40 years in arguably one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the entire country. An incredible combination of street smarts and you don't want to mess with me demeanor. Think of Lou Gossett Jr. in the movie Officer and a Gentleman. That was my father. All of my friends that I played football with that come to my house, my father owned a restaurant. We always had food. Okay? And think of the irony of that with what my father went through. My huge buddies were petrified of my father. The second reason I've come back to this slide, the Holocaust wiped out 2/3 of Central and Eastern European Jewish population. It went from 9 million to only 3 million, 6 million perished, 2/3 lost their lives. But of all the groups or subgroups that the Nazis murdered, Jewish children were the most severely treated. An estimated 100,000 survived out of 1.6 million. And of those 100,000, most of them survived by hiding. That equates to 6%. So using 6% of this class, 3 kids out of this class would have survived out of 42. 3. Well, I couldn't find any childhood pictures of my father yet. I'm not giving up. Sadly, descendants of Holocaust survivors do this quite frequently. We call it mining the archives. I have been known to spend countless hours. Sometimes my wife will come down to my office, and at 6 in the morning, I've been up all night digging through stuff. I did stumble across this picture. The arrow is pointing to a person who I am convinced is my father. Because again, this was a soccer team taken in the displaced persons camp he was in after the war. After doing some detective work and finding similar era pictures of him, this is without a doubt my father. Look at the angle of his ear, the angle of his nose, the angle of his jaw, and the hair. The most convincing part of my detective work is one of the 3 female cousins that survived from his mother's side, Minnie Osher, was our longest living survivor. I saw her last January, a year ago. I showed her this picture, gave her a little context, and I said, "Who is that man?" And she said, "Itsc." So she confirmed it for me. Sadly, we just lost her around Thanksgiving at the age of 95 or 96. So you're probably a bit puzzled and wondering why I call this presentation Corresponding Angles. While my father's story is not that different than other Holocaust survivor stories, there is truly something fascinating about this one, and it starts with this man. This is Dr. Jack Houston, for those of you who may not recognize him, of the famed Houston Clinic in Columbus, Georgia. I was fortunate enough to do my sports medicine fellowship there in 1996. With the year I did my fellowship, the clinic had 10 fellows. There were a multitude of doctors, not to Dr. Houston, a huge number, because most places have 1 or maybe 2 fellows. He had 10. They hand-selected 2 to spend time and see patients with Dr. Houston. I was fortunate to be one of those 2. For those of you not familiar what it's like for a fellow to see patients with an attending, I would go in, I would get the story, I would come out and give a bullet presentation to the attending, in this case, Dr. Houston. This is what this patient has. This is what I think is going on. This is what I think we should do about it. And then he would walk in and take over. What struck me immediately was how personable Dr. Houston was with all of his patients. It was more of a social visit than a clinical one. He would ask about the patient's spouse, their parents, their cousins, how their job was going, how Bobby's football game or Susie's soccer game, he knew their kids' names was. It was a thing of beauty to see the patients' faces. At first show surprise that he remembered, but more importantly, appreciation that he cared. And I told myself, this is exactly the kind of doctor I want to be. I want to emulate everything about Dr. Houston. As a result, I got to know many of my patients extremely well. One of these patients is Gail Cohn. I've given this presentation, I don't know how many times, 15, 20, I've lost count. This is the part that always gets me because it's so fascinating. She came to see me in 2012 after a long hiatus. After we finished with the clinical visit and talking about Georgia football, I asked about her father, Judge Aaron Cohn, who I knew peripherally because I lived in Columbus, where he was a highly respected, highly regarded judge. And she had told me that he had just passed away a few weeks earlier. She went on to say that she was returning to her beloved Columbus, her hometown, to speak at the National Infantry Museum as they were presenting her family and her father, who just passed, the honor of naming the Holocaust exhibit in the World War II section of that museum in his memory. Now I'm fascinated, puzzled. Gail, why are they doing that? Why are they naming it in your father's memory? Because he was a respected Jewish figure in Columbus, Georgia? And she said, no, my father fought in World War II. He was a major in Patton's Third Army. And he liberated a concentration camp. Now I'm stunned. What? What concentration camp, Gail? Ebensee, a subcamp of Mauthausen. Now I'm in utter disbelief. I'm crying. And I said to her, Gail, it is very possible that your father liberated my father. Both of us were in tears upon realizing our newly discovered connection, and more importantly, our father's corresponding ankles. It is now my honor and privilege to turn things over to my patient, co-presenter, and dear friend, Gail Cohn, to tell the rest of our story.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we must note that as the years have passed, that hatred has increased exponentially, and that includes an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. I recently saw a movie in which one of the lines was, "Governments have no souls. Human beings have souls." So it becomes critical that we honor the institutions on which our nation was founded, that we do not become bystanders, that we do not allow hatred to become normalized as it did in Nazi Germany, and that together we become the stalwarts of history and the protectors of truths and freedoms. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Just to put this story into a historical perspective, I'd like to begin with a military timeline that takes Aaron to Europe. Now, some of the things I'm going to tell you are not on this military timeline. Aaron enlists by active duty in 1940, and of course that's before Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. It is also in 1941 that he marries Janet Ann Lilienthal. Then in September of 1943, he sails to Scotland on the Aquitania. I am born in August of 43, so I'm only 1 month old when he leaves, and I'm a little over 2 when he returns home. If you'll look at this, in September of 1943, you will see after he sails, gets to Scotland, and then June the 6th, 1944, as we all know, is D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. My mother's brother, Leslie Lilienthal Jr., is killed on Omaha Beach. He is buried in the All-American Cemetery, St. James Cemetery in Brittany, France, and his grave is marked with a simple Star of David with the day and date that he was born and the day and date that he was killed in action. In August of 1944, Aaron arrives at Utah Beach, and of course, Omaha Beach and Utah Beach are the two American beaches. He arrives at Utah Beach, where he's now reassigned to General Patton's Third Army. And you know your history from General George Patton, that his goal is to outflank the Germans and get to Berlin before anybody else. So they're moving fast. And before you know it, they are liberating Luxembourg. A couple of months later, they are 30 miles south of the Battle of the Bulge. They fight their way across Europe. And then it's May the 6th, 1945, with the liberation of the concentration camp in Ebensee, Austria. Our story begins in this beautiful little resort town in Ebensee. It's located at the base of the Austrian Alps. It's May of 1945. It's towards the end of the Second World War. And this is what the map of Europe looks like. As noted, these pink dots denote the death camps, the extermination camps. And the blue dots that are scattered throughout this part of Europe are the concentration camps. And concentration camps such as Ebensee are established by the Nazis, and it represents the deliberate and systematic murder of innocent people. Aaron is in the 3rd Cavalry, part of the 3rd Armored Division. His unit is the eyes and the ears of the Corps. The Corps, it's the 20th Corps. It's about 3 divisions, 15,000 men. Their job is to go out ahead of the troops, find the enemy, report back to the commanding officer. The average age of the soldier is 19. Aaron is 29, and he's a major in General Patton's Third Army, and he is the chief reconnaissance officer. Aaron is in a tank, a half-track tank, and he's got a 50 caliber machine gun, a gun crew. It's a traveling command post. All orders come out of that vehicle, and it's a job that involves life and death of every moment of every day. As Aaron is following close behind one of the 3rd Cavalry tanks, he notices that they've gotten a message from one of his friends that they have stumbled upon a concentration camp in Austria. And when that happens, he is summoned by his commanding officer to come go with him, because he knows Aaron is Jewish and he would want to be part of that mission. And when Aaron leaves for this mission, he has absolutely no idea what he was going to find. So tonight I come to you as a liberator's daughter, as Reuben comes to you as a survivor's son. As you know, my name is Gail Cohn, and I am the daughter of the late retired Colonel Judge Aaron Cohn. And it really is my privilege to share this story with you for the next 15 minutes or so, because the lives of Itsc Sladowski and Aaron Cohn have become part of our heritage and part of our legacy. And the fact, as Reuben shared, that our lives crossed in this particular manner is nothing short of amazing. So when Aaron enters the gates of Ebensee, after being summoned by his commanding officer to come go with him, he has absolutely no idea what he's going to find. When he enters the gates of Ebensee, he notices that the guard towers are abandoned, that the barbed wire fence that was armed and electrified is now disarmed. And then he walks further into the courtyard, and he sees about 100 survivors that are standing in filth in their prison-striped uniforms. Some are naked, others, as he would later describe, are bones and yellow skin. Dead bodies are everywhere, eyes staring blankly up at the sky, maggots crawling all over them. And the stench of the sick, and the smell of the dead, and the odor of feces and urine is beyond imaginable, unbearable. The survivors are now looking at Aaron, and they see him with his .45 shoulder holster gun and his combat groups and his combat boots, and they shrink in fear. And he says to them in Yiddish, and as you know, Many of you that Yiddish is the lowland of German, and it's a language that most of the Jews of this part of Europe speak. And he says to them in Yiddish that, no, I'm not an SS officer. I'm an American major in the United States Army. And then he says to them, Ich bin a Yid. In Yiddish, Ich bin a Yid. I am a Jew. Hearing his words, the prisoners wept. They kissed at his feet. They tore at his clothes. They tried to lift him, but they were too weak. For Aaron, this experience was beyond emotional. He was forever changed by what he saw. And the sights and the sounds and the smells of Ebensee were with him for all of his days. Now, as you can well imagine, the most urgent need is for medical care and food. But it was particularly difficult to feed half-starved people. We didn't know much about that in those days. And so, unfortunately, many of the survivors died of intestinal disorders after the liberation. The camp remains largely in the care of the 3rd Cavalry Reconnaissance soldiers and medical personnel until the morning of May the 9th. And Aaron and his 4-star general, James Polk, whom he loved dearly, remained there for those 3 days together. Documenting history, we find that Ebensee was one of the worst concentration camps for death rates because of the inhumane conditions, the inadequate food, the constant beatings, the hard labor in a harsh environment. The barracks at Ebensee originally were about 25 of them, and they were designed for 100 people. By the end of the war, they hold as many as 750. These barracks were made of wooden siding, leaky roofs, concrete floors, and absolutely no sanitation. The first crematoriums at Ebensee are built in May of 1944. Before that, the dead and the dying are sent back to Mauthausen to be cremated. Ebensee, as you know, was one of the satellite camps of Mauthausen, where Itsc Sladowski is living out his nightmare. He was most likely sent there on any given day for torturous slave labor. By 1945, there were so many deaths that mass graves had to be dug. When the camp is liberated in 1945, there were about 16,000 prisoners. We know this because the German kept impeccable records. Everything was documented. And we know from those documents that at one time, there were as many as 18,000 prisoners from 20 different nationalities, and that the Jews were the most harshly treated. By the end of the war, Ebensee is about 40% Jewish. It's interesting to note that after the war, everything is demolished at Ebensee by the Austrian government. There are no more barracks. There are no more barbed wire fences. There are no more guard towers. And everything that's there is demolished to erase the evil that was once done there. The Austrian government gave that land for free to certain people to build houses. It became a neighborhood. And it's not until 1988 that the then president of Austria, Kurt Waldheim, who, by the way, was later found to be morally complicit in Nazi crimes, but nevertheless, the president of Austria, Kurt Waldheim, says it's time for the Austrian people to face its past. And it's not until 2012 that a wall with 8,500 names is built that lists the names of people who were once only known by numbers. Today, you will find a simple archway with a memorial plaque to denote where the barracks once existed. Revisiting history. In May of 2014, almost 69 years to the day that my father helped to liberate that concentration camp, my husband Harvey Danitz and I go there. The weather that day was rainy, it was dark, the weather was cold, the weather was dreary, the weather was appropriate for the visit. We drove through that beautiful little resort town of Ebensee with its clock tower, and we realized that the concentration camp had been but 2 short miles from the center of town. As we went ahead with the drive, the forest became thick. We saw the existing rock quarry, and the efficient rail lines were still there. As I got out of the car to retrace my father's steps, there was a train coming down those tracks, blowing its eerie whistle, and I thought about the masses of humanity that were once packed into those cattle cars, many of whom had died standing up. I began the walk of the long and winding roads to the tunnels, where our guide told us that as many as 15,000 prisoners had been jammed into those subterranean tunnels to work and build and store munitions for the Third Reich. The ultimate goal was to build a jet plane and missiles that would reach the United States. We saw the markers for the mass graves and the memorials that were established by countries whose citizens had been transported there and who had died there. When I saw the memorial that was placed by the state of Israel, I couldn't help but wonder how many of those 6 million murdered Jews might have been saved if there had been an Israel to receive the Jews of Europe when so many other countries had closed their doors. When Aaron Cohn returned to his beloved hometown of Columbus, Georgia in October of 1945, he found that nobody wanted to talk about the war or hear about what he had seen. So he went back to practicing law, playing tennis, going to University of Georgia football games, and being active in civic, social, and religious affairs. But Aaron was haunted by a promise that he had made to a survivor, a man whose family had lived in Vienna for 800 years, a man who had been decorated with the Austrian Iron Cross by the government for his bravery in the First World War and who had been a prominent attorney. And he said to Aaron, "Look at me now. I'm a walking cadaver. My wife, my children, my family, all murdered in the Holocaust, and simply because we were born of the Jewish faith." And he said to Aaron, "When you get back to the United States of America, promise me you won't forget about us. Promise me you will tell our story." And Aaron said, "I promise I won't forget about you, and I will tell your story." And here is a picture of Aaron at age 95 as he continued to tell that story for the rest of his life. Now that my father and Reuben's father can no longer tell the story, we embrace that responsibility. I am my father's daughter. Reuben is his father's son. We are their legacy, and now we are their voice. The atrocities that Aaron Cohn saw during the Second World War and the atrocities that Itsc survived, as you know, forever changed their lives. Once there is hatred, it is boundless, and everyone suffers. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Aaron Cohn never did nothing. Among his many actions at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 1960 to 1964, he became the chief voter registrar of Muskogee County, which is Columbus, Georgia. And he set up tents in downtown Columbus, and he had black voters register white people and white voters register black people. He said if white hands could touch black hands and black hands could touch white hands, maybe we could humanize one another. Aaron had seen way too much humanization already. Aaron became a legend for the good that he had done. Today, awards are given in his name, and he received hundreds of awards during his lifetime. His legacy lives on through his book, Memoirs of a First-Generation American, the Aaron Cohn Youth Detention Center, the Aaron Cohn Middle School, and is noted the Holocaust exhibit at Fort Benning, which was Fort Benning, which is now Fort Moore. The Holocaust exhibit at the National Soldiers and Infantry Museum is dedicated to him. There is a plaque that reads, dedicated to Judge Aaron Cohn, Colonel, United States Army, retired, and it embraces the words of a jurist, a liberator, and a patriot. On display is a replica of a portrait of Aaron at 40 with his .45 shoulder holster gun. At age 29, a major in General Patton's Third Army, exactly as he looked when he walked into that concentration camp that Itsc survived. This portrait was painted by a survivor on his last day in that nightmarish camp in Ebensee, Austria, a satellite camp of Mauthausen. Aaron Cohn was born on March the 3rd, 1916 in Columbus, Georgia, and he died on the anniversary of America's independence, July 4th. The year was 2012. There was a 21-gun salute. General H.R. McMaster, who was the commandant at Fort Benning, which is only 6 miles from the center of Columbus, Georgia's downtown, General H.R. McMaster gave one of the eulogies, and taps was played. Indeed, it was a fitting date because central to Aaron's life was his love of our great nation, of choices, opportunities, and religious freedoms. Aaron always said, we must remember the lessons of history. 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews all died because they were somehow perceived as different. Among those murdered were 1.5 million Jewish children who never had a chance at life. It was the impetus for Aaron to become the longest serving, oldest sitting juvenile court judge in the nation. He was on the bench for 46 years. He retired at 95. He was known as the judge of second chances, and he represented this country both nationally and internationally. To begin to conclude, I still believe in you and me. I believe that we will stand up against injustice so that children and women and men, such as Reuben Sloan's father, will never again know the worst of humanity, our inhumanity, and we still have much work to do. On behalf of our fathers, let me conclude with the words my father, Aaron Cohn, would use were he with you this evening. May God bless each of you, and may God bless America.
So at this time, we'll open up for questions. Yeah, we'll open it up for questions. We'll start with people in person, and then I'll hop to Zoom. Or if we're shot, oh, we got one question right there, and I have a bunch, so you guys don't ask out.
Reuben, you posed the question, about your father almost coming to New Orleans. And tell us how he almost came to New Orleans.
Thank you. So my father told me that he was supposed to come to New Orleans, and he never elaborated. And during my digging, I came across a document that actually showed him on the manifesto for a ship that was destined for New Orleans. So what happened is, so after the war, people just couldn't come to the United States. You had to be sponsored. So you have to have a family member, a relative that would vouch for you, which ended up happening with him, with Uncle Meyer in Los Angeles. But before Uncle Meyer knew that he survived, the Jewish National Fund, or whatever it was called at the time, here in New Orleans, heard about my father being orphaned, and they agreed to sponsor him. So he was supposed to come here. And then shortly thereafter, Uncle Meyer found him, so he went to Los Angeles. So, thank you.
Given the stories that both of you have just shared, what is your subjective take on what's going on in America today as parallel with what happened in Europe?
I would like to answer it in a circuitous way, since I'm not an authority on politics and I don't want to represent myself as such. But I remember my father saying a couple of things that I'd like to share with you. One is, one of the things that's always made our country great is that we have always been a country of laws and not a country of men. That is of a concern. The other thing is that he used to like to quote the Reverend Niemöller, who was a German Lutheran minister who was arrested by the Gestapo and was incarcerated in Dachau until he was liberated by the Allies in 1945. And you may remember his quote, which is, "I didn't speak up," in which he said, the Nazis came for the communists and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Protestants and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Protestant. Then they came for me. And by then, there was no one left to speak for me. So I think that those philosophies that we have learned from the Second World War, where we don't speak up and we don't stand up for the foundations on which our nation was founded, we're in trouble. That Blacks must speak up for whites, whites must speak up for Blacks, Jews must speak up for Christians, and Christians must speak up for Jews, because when we speak up for one another, I believe that we have more of an impact. And the fact that we are getting into silos and there isn't the civility and the respect for the law, I think is of great concern. And when I say we still have lots of work to do, I guess that's what I'm thinking. Does that address some of what you were looking for?
So very quickly for me to comment on that. So there's a quote, and it's very simple but profound. Those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. And sadly, as time passes, it's 80 years. And most of the Holocaust survivors are dying off. There's an estimated 250,000 left out of 3 million that are still around, but they're elderly and frail, and many don't have their faculties. So sadly, people still question if it ever happened. You know, the Holocaust, it was made up. And whenever I hear that, it irks me to the core, because I grew up with no grandparents. You know, I had very few cousins, only from my mom's side. Anyways, we have to, that's why we're here. We're here to educate people. And, you know, we're speaking to the choir, basically, preaching to the choir, but hopefully there's a lot of people on Zoom who are going to share their story about what we just told and disseminate it, and hopefully we can educate people.
And if I might, there was one more thing that my father, two more things actually that my father always used to say, and he sort of sits on my shoulders when I do something like this. He would always say that life is not a popularity contest. Life is about doing the right thing and doing what's fair, regardless of a person's ethnicity, religion, political opinions, sexual orientation, or station in life. And we must go back to having a moral code with one another.
Go ahead and then I'll ask.
Is this someone else? No, you go. I'd just like to say that I knew Aaron. He was as wonderful as Gail has described him. He was a fantastic person and a mentor to a lot of younger people in our community. And I thank you for giving him his due tonight.
Thank you. I will tell you that at one time I was a single parent, and the way that he helped me was he took my boys to the jail and he put them in a holding cell and he said to them, take a good look at this holding cell because you're never going to see it again. Because if you break the law, I'm going to kill you first. So he had that sense of humor, but he lived the values that he preached. He really did not just walk the walk. I mean, he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. So thank you, Lorraine.
Some folks online have asked, or first it's a compliment and then I'll ask a question. You have both done amazing work researching and sharing your father's most notable lives and sharing their histories with us. Have you done any work or shared your stories with Facing History, Facing Ourselves? I'm just curious how, or if you have opportunities to share your stories with children. Facing History, Facing Ourselves is a Holocaust education tool for young people.
Yes.
So a little background. So this presentation came into existence kind of by accident, but out of need, like any other thing that happens. So I sit on the committee for the planning committee for the Houston Society meeting. The Houston Society meeting is a medical meeting that people that train there, did fellowships there, residency through there, work there. We have a meeting every 2 years for people to get CME, continuing medical education units, and it's a small meeting, and we rub elbows with world-renowned sports doctors, et cetera. And we needed something for the keynote address. And 2 years earlier, because it's every 2-year meeting, one of my former partners, Dr. Carlton Savory, got up at the keynote thing, which is in the Infantry Museum in the atrium the night before we all split up and go home. And that presentation is usually reserved for something humanitarian or the human element, not necessarily clinical medicine. And he talked about something called Operation Eagle Claw, which nobody knows. You will, when I explain what it is the code name for the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt in 1979. He was the colonel in the army who was in charge of the medical piece. So it got declassified and he could talk about it. So he was up there at the podium talking about it, spilling his guts and crying because they lost people and he felt guilty for it and responsible, even though it was his fault. And so we're sitting at on this Zoom call and we're talking about presenting the next meeting, and people are coming up with ideas, and I'm like, no, out of respect to what Dr. Savory just told us a few months ago, we have to have something profound like that. And they're like, well, what do you recommend? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm just telling you what I don't want it to be. So at the end of the phone call, I said, actually, I have an interesting story. And I told them about our connection. They're like, you need to make that happen. Okay. So sorry for the elaborate explanation, but I'm getting to the point, I promise. We know that we have to do this. And this also feeds into the asterisk on my father's date of birth and date of death. We know that we have to do this. And it's supposed to happen in 2021. The pandemic pushes it out a year. And then it pushes it out a week because of some conflict. And I'm nervous because I know my father's story, but I don't have slides. I don't have photographs. I don't have documents. I have to do a deep dive into researching this. And I'm a ridiculously busy physician. I work, believe it or not, 16-hour days. I spend 11 hours in the office and I come home, I eat with my wife, and I'm in my front of my computer preparing for the next day, another 3.5 to 5 hours. When am I going to do this? The meeting happens in April of 21, and January of 21, something's wrong with me. And I go to my GI doctor who does my every, so many years colonoscopy, and I'm like, David, something's wrong. And I tell him, and he goes, okay, we're going to check all these things. Long story short, I had colon cancer. We caught it so early that I'm totally fine. Surgery was considered a cure, but I had to take off a minimum of 7, better yet 8 weeks. The surgeon told me, if you don't do that, if you don't promise me, I'm not operating, you're going to find somebody else. So I promised. After 2 weeks, I was good enough to sit. In the 5 to 6 weeks that I was not working and didn't have 16-hour days, I wrote this presentation. It got disseminated in Atlanta. The Bremen, which is the Holocaust Museum there, heard it. They wanted us to present it. We did. The day after Georgia beat LSU.
Yes, I know.
And they've asked me to tell my father's part to kids, and I go 6, 8, 10 times a year. And that's my favorite because they're 10-year-olds, they're 12-year-olds. They're my father's age. So back to the asterisk. So that, yes, we're doing stuff educating children. So very quickly with the asterisks. So the date of birth. All the documents say August 15th, 1925. My sister Rosemary, who's probably still watching, the responsible sister, Itsc, star child, golden child, her birthday's August 13th. And he would always claim that they shared a birthday. And we're like, no, Dad, your birthday is the 15th. No, it's the 13th. What we came to learn was that kids who weren't 14 could not work. And if you could not work, you did not get a ration card for food. So suddenly there was a complete disappearance of all kids 12 and 13. They magically became 14. And knowing my father and how street smart he was, that's exactly what he did. The second reason I know that he made himself 2 years older is he was never bar mitzvah. There is no way his parents would have let him escape getting bar mitzvah. I said he was 14. He was probably really 12. Date of death. This one is fascinating. As I mentioned, the meeting was moved because of the pandemic, and then a week later, a week earlier, his yurt site is right after sundown, seconds after sundown, going into the last day of Pesach. We're secular Jews. I mean, we celebrate Passover, we celebrate Hanukkah. I don't know what the last. How I know that is the rabbi that led the ceremony when he passed away, his funeral, asked about my dad because he wanted to give an elaborate speech about him. And he asked when he died, and we told him Saturday, and he goes, before or after sundown? After, why? Huh. That's the 22nd day of Nisan. That's the last day of Pesach. That's a day that we believe is reserved for special people. What was special about your dad? He survived the Holocaust. I mean, that's it. We gave the presentation for the first time at the Natural History Museum on the 22nd of Nisan, minutes after sundown, 15 years to the day, to the minute that he passed on. So on his yurt site, randomly.
And I was so happy to connect with Reuben to join these stories. But for me, I met someone earlier who had been with the ADL. I used to do a World of Difference for the Anti-Defamation League. I do a lot of interfaith work where I've traveled with Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And I used to do conflict resolution in the workforce. So I've tried to use whatever skills that I've been fortunate to learn or study to try to make difference in other ways. And before Reuben and I connected, I did do a much longer presentation just on my father to talk about the lessons that he talked about in the Holocaust. And one of the things that he used to talk about was the age-old hatred of nationalities, and how even in the concentration camps, sometimes they couldn't come together when they still had strength. because of nationalities and hatreds of nationalities that were throughout Europe. So this has been an extra privilege for me to be able to tell this story with Reuben.
Is the story available if we wanted to share it with family members and beyond visiting?
Yeah, so interesting you should ask that. So when we were writing this and putting it together the first time, the Houston clinic, I told them, I go, we really have something special here. Will you please film it? And it's a full service sports medicine clinic, so they have videographers and stuff. So we have that, it's on YouTube, but it's hard to find. I can get you the link. But last Sunday,
Mhm.
we were in Montgomery. The Jewish Federation hosted a rather large event. There were over 300 people there. There were bomb sniffing dogs and police doing security. Sad, but that's the way it is nowadays with Jewish gatherings. And there was a professional media crew and a videographer crew that are putting together a very highly produced, professionally produced piece that we will have hopefully in a few weeks. And then we can share it.
And for me, because I have these 6 grandchildren, I'm excited about it because I want to leave a legacy for my family about their grandfather, their great-grandfather, and that at least their mother and their grandmother tried to do something to make things better. There's somebody in the back.
I have one question online, and then I think we can do one in person. We'll end the Zoom and then we can just chat.
Okay.
Rusty Palmer asks, Gail, did your dad or family encounter any anti-Semitism in Columbus or Selma?
Well, thank you, Rusty. Rusty and my family go way back from Selma, Alabama days, and his brother Eddie. But my father said that there was anti-Semitism when he was growing up, and he found that there was some anti-Semitism in the armed forces as well. It's like, here's this Jewish guy who's a combat officer, and sometimes there were disparaging remarks that would be made, and they wouldn't know he was Jewish. And his response was, buddy, I think you're fighting on the wrong side. But the anti-Semitism that I experienced in Columbus, Georgia, was more of the type, Gail, we really like you, and we're worried that you haven't accepted Jesus as the Christ, and we don't want you to go to hell. And so for me, I knew that my friends were genuinely caring about me, and they were worried. So we would have conversations about that so that we could understand that we felt that whatever you believed, if you really believed it, it was okay, so long as you were kind and good to another person. You don't have to worry about what's next. So that would be something that I would experience. But in Selma and in Columbus, it was a little bit different. The Selma Country Club allowed both Jews and Christians. They all belonged in some of the smaller southern towns. In Columbus, Georgia, we had a religious and a color line. So the Jewish community had its own country clubs. And somehow I think that in small southern towns, we were very secular. And I don't think it's any mistake that this is called the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience and not the Jewish Southern Experience. It is my feeling, and you may disagree, that we were Southern first, and our Jewishness was very important to us. But as children of the South, Southern culture was extremely important to us. So I even say I'm a Southern Jew. I don't, for whatever reason, I don't say I'm a Jewish Southerner, which is always in a kind of an interesting discussion.
So very briefly to comment on that. So whenever I was whenever I had people say to me, you know, if you don't accept Christ, you're not going to get to heaven. I would always say, wait a second, Judaism is the original religion. You're basing your religion on our religion, so we get grandfathered in. We're good.
Good for you.
Any other questions in this? Do I get the last one? Did your fathers ever meet? Did they actually meet in the concentration camp, or did?
Oh, no, I'm gonna let you tell that story.
So so I kept the presentation pretty much close to the original. I didn't add this piece, hoping it would come up in questions, and so thank you. We don't know for absolute certain, but there is a bit of information that has come to light in the last year that I believe confirms it. So as I mentioned, it was taped by the Houston Clinic the first time we gave it. And my fun sister, Leah, I sent her the presentation, and after pushing her, she finally watched it with her common law husband. They've been together for 40 years and never married, but that's called a story. His name is David. David is from Iowa. David, not Jewish, was in the military. And as most Holocaust survivors, my father did not like to talk about this. It was pulling teeth for me to get anything out of him. But he would tell me morsels. He would tell my brother morsels. He would tell David morsels. And the part that he told David is the convincing part. So after they saw the presentation, David said to my sister, I remember your father talking about a major that he really admired in Patton's army. Third Army, the cavalry, the 3rd, the 33rd. He couldn't remember the number. He knew there was a 3 in it. And this major could speak to my father. My father didn't know English then. He spoke
Yiddish.
Hebrew.
Yiddish.
I mean, sorry, Yiddish. He spoke Polish. He spoke German. He didn't know English. So who else could that be? A major in Patton's 3rd Army that was in that part of the world that could communicate with my father who spoke Yiddish? I mean, I think that's pretty convincing evidence that it was Aaron Cohn. Thank you.
And we're sticking to that story. We're sticking to that story.
Yeah, sadly, David passed away just a few months ago too, like many. So I'm glad he shared that with me before he passed.
So we can keep asking questions, but my computer's gonna dead. So I'm gonna end the Zoom. Call, just stick around for 1 second.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just to close everything out, we're interested to hear from everybody about your interest in programs like this. We're a pretty new shop and we appreciate every and all feedback. Please keep up to date with what's happening at the museum. You can do so on our newsletter and social media. We have a slew of upcoming programs, including some fun king cake programs next week and some also fun programs related to our special exhibition after Mardi Gras. A recording of today's presentation will be available on YouTube, and I really want to say thank you so much from the bottom of the museum's heart, my heart, to Gail and Reuben for sharing your father's story. So thank you so, so much. Thank you. I'm going to end the Zoom. And then we're